The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of pink and gold. Elijah pedaled through the quiet streets of the neighborhood where he'd grown up, knowing every turn, every crack in the pavement. The evening seemed perfect. The breeze fluttered his t-shirt, and the familiar rhythm of the music on his headphones made him feel calm and carefree. But that calm was deceptive. The screech of the car's brakes came so sharply that Elijah jerked involuntarily. For a second, his heart clenched with surprise, but he didn't think much of it. Police cars sometimes drove through their neighborhood in the evening. It was a regular occurrence, but something about the sound, the overly abrupt and deliberate braking, made him look away. A black and white patrol car stood a few meters behind. The car door opened, and a large white policeman stepped out. The officer's face was cold, his gaze piercing, and his hand dangerously close to the gun on his belt. "Hey, you!" he shouted sharply, and his voice echoed down the empty street. Elijah slowed down, but didn't stop completely. He felt his breathing grow heavier, and his fingers gripped the steering wheel a little harder. He didn't understand why the officer was paying attention to him. "Stay where you are." The voice became even sharper, and the officer's steps quicker. Elijah slowed down and turned around. His gaze met the policeman's, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. The officer's face was contorted in an expression that was nothing short of contempt. "Get off the bike," he ordered, his hand already resting on his gun. Elijah froze. His instincts were screaming, "Don't move, don't show fear," but his whole body was gripped by fear. Why him? Why now? Questions arose in the young man's mind, but the answers were too obvious. "I'm just going home," he began cautiously, but his voice shook as if the very air around him was growing heavier. "I said get off." The policeman stepped closer, and the metallic click that accompanied the removal of the weapon from its holster rang in Elijah's ears like thunder. Every nerve in the teenager's body screamed danger. There was no more wind, no more music, no more quiet neighborhood where he felt safe. There was only the street, the lone figure of a teenager on a bicycle, and the man who held him at gunpoint as if he were a criminal. A neighbor on the porch froze, dropping her newspaper. 3 children, playing in the distance, disappeared around the corner when they heard the scream. The silence became dense, viscous. Elijah stared at the officer, his lips trembling with the urge to say something else. But he knew that every word could be his last. That minute stretched endlessly, and he had no idea that this incident would forever change not only his life, but the lives of everyone he cared about. The policeman stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding loudly on the pavement, breaking the almost sepulchral silence of the street. Elijah stood stiffly, his bicycle lying at his feet like further proof of his helplessness. The cold, metallic glint of the weapon pointed at him seemed unreal. "Hands up where I can see them." The policeman's voice was harsh, almost growling, as if he were dealing not with a teenager, but with a dangerous criminal. Elijah raised his hand slowly, his gaze running between the officer and the gun. He felt a cold sweat roll down his back. He wanted to say something, to explain that he hadn't done anything wrong, but the words stuck in his throat. "You think I don't know what you're doing here?" the policeman hissed, his eyes drilling the young man. "I was just driving home," Elijah squeezed out quietly, but heard a mocking chuckle in response. "Home? Really?" The cop tilted his head, pretending to ponder. "I know your kind. Your homes are the alleys where you deal drugs and hide your guns. Where's your gang, huh? Or are you here on a recon mission?" The words hit Elijah like a hammer blow. His hands trembled, but he held them up, afraid to move. "Yeah, I don't understand," he began, but the officer cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Don't you understand?" The man moved closer, his face now only a few inches from Elijah's. "Let me explain. You are a threat. You and people like you. You think you can walk around my neighborhood like it's yours, but not today." The policeman stepped back and pointed his weapon at the ground. "On your knees." Elijah froze. His knees trembled, but he couldn't bring himself to obey the order. It wasn't just humiliation. It was an insult that went deep into his soul. "I said kneel," the officer bellowed, raising the gun sharply higher, pointing it directly at the teenager's face. Passers-by began to gather nearby, but no one dared to come closer. Whispered murmurs echoed through the crowd, but no one stepped up for the young man. A woman with a cell phone in her hands was filming what was happening, her hand trembling with horror. Elijah slowly sank to his knees. The asphalt was hot, but he couldn't feel it. The cold was too strong, binding his heart. "That's it. Good for you," the policeman threw mockingly, starting to slowly circle the teenager. His voice was drenched in contempt. "Now tell me, where did you hide the goods? Drugs? Maybe you have a gun in your backpack? Or are you just here to spy for your buddies?" "I have nothing," Elijah whispered, his voice almost breaking with fear and humiliation. "Of course you have nothing," the policeman replied, nodding, but his tone was mocking. "You know what I see when I look at you? A potential criminal. Someone needs to teach people like you their place." At that moment, he kicked the bicycle that lay nearby, throwing it aside with force. Elijah flinched, but didn't move. The crowd watched, but no one took a step forward. People were afraid. Some turned away to avoid seeing a teenager being humiliated in the street. "Do you know how many people like you I've seen? You're all the same. You think the laws aren't for you?" The policeman continued, leaning closer to him. "But today, you're going to find out what's what." Tears came to Elijah's eyes, but he forced himself not to cry. Not here, not now. It was too cruel, too unfair, but he knew that any wrong move or word could end this scene in tragedy. And in the distance, behind the backs of the silent crowd, one person did not remain indifferent. The woman with the camera stopped shaking. She knew what she had to do. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether something similar happened in your life. Share your thoughts. We value your opinion. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. And now we continue. Elijah was on his knees, his thin shoulders shaking, but he forced himself not to show tears. The policeman loomed in front of him, like a predator enjoying his prey. His heavy boots stomped the dirt next to the teenager's feet, kicking up dust that settled on Elijah's light-colored shorts and dark skin. "You think you can walk these streets like it's your territory?" The policeman squinted, leaning closer with a sneer. "Waving your license around, huh? I'll show you how the real world works." The crowd was getting larger. People watched from the sidewalk, from the windows of their houses. Some pretended to pass by, and others stopped, clutching their phones, but dared not interfere. "You're more used to kneeling, aren't you?" The policeman smirked. "This is your place. The streets aren't for you. You're nobody here." Elijah clenched his teeth tightly. He wanted to scream that it wasn't his fault, that he was just on his way home, but every word stuck in his throat like a lump. The officer glanced around the crowd, noticing the woman with the phone. "Are you filming?" he asked sharply, his voice sounding like a whip. The woman recoiled but didn't put the camera away. The policeman looked at Elijah again and added louder for all to hear, "Here, look. You're filming, aren't you? Good. Let everyone see me do my job. And you." He jabbed a finger in the teenager's face. "Stay in the dirt. It's the best place for people like you." Elijah felt nausea coming up his throat. The dirt beneath his knees was getting stickier and stickier, and he knew this was a moment he would remember forever. "What's in the backpack? Weapons? Drugs?" The policeman yanked the backpack from the teenager's shoulders without waiting for an answer. He tossed it to the ground and, carelessly opening the zipper, began shaking out the contents. Books, notebooks, and a bottle of water fell into the dirt. "You call that proof of innocence?" The officer pushed the notebook with the toe of his boot, picking it up from the dirt. "Books? Don't make me laugh. You're definitely hiding something. You always have something." The crowd began to whisper. Someone tried to move closer, but the policeman's gaze stopped them. "What? You think I'm too tough?" he blurted out, looking into the faces of passers-by. "I'll tell you one thing. Men like him are just what they deserve. If you knew how many of them I've seen. Everyone thinks they're victims, but they're not. He'd have robbed your house by tomorrow or sold something to your kids." Elijah felt tears come to his eyes. He turned away so no one would notice, but at that moment a policeman grabbed his chin, turning his face roughly toward his own. "Don't look away when I'm talking to you," he barked. The man's hand was hard and cold, like the very system he represented. Elijah wanted to scream, wanted to hit him, but realized that any movement could be fatal. "Be thankful I'm giving you a lesson. And pray you don't end up in places where you'll be put in your place quickly." The officer dropped his chin and stood up, straightening up. At that moment, the woman with the phone stepped forward. Her voice sounded louder and bolder than Elijah had expected. "This is crazy. He's a baby." The policeman turned around, his eyes narrowed. "You want to join me? Maybe you'll find something suspicious too," he hissed, taking a step in her direction. The woman backed away but kept shooting. Elijah was broken, but what scared him even more was how indifferent the crowd looked. The world seemed so unfair that it made him want to disappear. Everything that was happening was a humiliation to him that wouldn't end even if this nightmare did. All he could do was stay quiet, trying not to break down completely under the stares of the crowd and the aggression that was felt with every word of the officer. The heavy silence of the street was broken by the sound of the policeman's voice as he continued to shout accusations. His words sounded like a sentence from which there was no escape. Elijah remained on his knees, feeling the dirt beneath him soaking into his clothes, but it didn't matter. All he felt was humiliation, anger, and fear. From the crowd stepped a neighbor, an old woman with a wrinkled face and determination in her eyes. She was holding a cell phone that was already recording what was happening. The camera captured every second: Elijah's fear-stricken look, the textbooks crushed in the dirt, the policeman's rough face. "Hey!" a policeman shouted sharply, spotting her. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer as she continued filming, and that only made him angrier. He took a step toward her, but then turned sharply back to Elijah, as if to remind her who was in charge. "You think you can get away with this?" His voice was icy. He turned to the woman's cell, pointing at the teenager. "Take it off, please. Let everyone see who we're catching. Another petty criminal who thinks the law doesn't apply to him." The woman didn't say a word, but her hands trembled slightly. The policeman leaned toward Elijah like a predator leaning toward its prey. "You know how people like you end up?" he hissed, looking straight into the teenager's eyes. "They think they can run free until someone shows them their place." Then he turned around and walked over to the bicycle lying on the ground. In one sharp motion he kicked it, and the sound of metal hitting pavement echoed. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. "Look at this," he shouted, picking up the bike by the handlebars and scrutinizing it as if he were holding a weapon. "Or maybe it's stolen. What do you think?" Elijah, trying to maintain a modicum of dignity, said quietly, "That's my bike." "Yours?" "Of course it's yours," the policeman sarcastically retorted. "You probably stole it from someone who lives in a normal neighborhood." He threw the bike to the ground and stepped on it with his foot with force. The crunch of metal and crackle of plastic was deafening. The camera was capturing everything. The woman in the crowd tried her best to hold it steady to capture every moment. "Hey, you!" The policeman suddenly turned to her. "Turn that damn camera off or I'll find a reason to detain you too." She didn't stop. Her voice shook, but she answered, "You can't do that. I have the right to film." His eyes narrowed and he stepped closer, his fingers fiddling with the belt where the baton hung. "You'd better stop before I start on you," he hissed, but at that moment another man in the crowd picked up a phone. Then another. Now several cameras were pointed at him. The policeman stopped. His face flushed with anger, but he realized that the situation was getting out of control. He turned back to Elijah as if he wanted to take his rage out on him. "You think anyone's going to stand up for you?" he hissed, leaning toward the teenager. "It won't change anything. You'll stay what you were, a nobody. And if you show your face here again, it'll be worse." Elijah stayed on his knees, his gaze fixed on the pavement. He heard everything, but he couldn't find the strength to lift his head. The woman with the camera whispered, "I filmed the whole thing. They won't get away with it." But fear still held him in its grip. He knew that even this moment was just the beginning of a darker, more dangerous battle. James Brooks sat in his office, surrounded by impressive shelves filled with legal books and files. This office had always been his sanctuary, a place where he could remain calm even in the most difficult moments. But that evening, that calm was shattered by a single message on his phone. He opened the video he had received from a neighbor who explained with a brief note, "This is what happened to Elijah. You have to see it." James pressed play, and the screen came to life. His son, his pride, his legacy, his future was kneeling on the muddy ground. A policeman, disgust in his voice, was screaming in his face. The words filled with contempt and racism, the kicking of his bicycle, the humiliating questions about "Where's your gang?" All of it made James indescribably furious. The hand with the phone trembled. Every frame felt like a blow to his heart. James, a man who had believed in justice and laws all his life, saw those laws turn into weapons against his son. When the video ended, James didn't immediately realize that his breathing had become harsh and heavy. He clenched his teeth and closed his eyes, as if trying to find his strength. But the silence of the office now seemed deafening. Elijah sat in the living room, silent and broken. His eyes avoided meeting his father's, and his hands were clasped together so tightly that his knuckles were white. When James entered, his footsteps were sure, but his face betrayed anger and pain. "Elijah." His voice sounded hoarse but firm. The teen looked at his father, his eyes filling with tears. "Dad, he began, but the words broke off. James sat down across from him and spoke slowly, trying to deal with his emotions. "Why didn't you say anything to me?" Elijah looked down. I thought there was nothing you could do. You always said the system works if you believe in it, but it doesn't work for people like me." Those words hit James harder than any video could. His son, whom he had always taught to be proud of his identity, to believe in the power of the law, now saw himself as a victim of the system he, James, represented. "You're not a victim, Elijah," he said quietly, though a note of doubt trembled in his voice. "I was on my knees in the mud, Dad." Elijah suddenly raised his voice. "They looked at me like I was a criminal without even knowing me. He said I was a nobody." James stood up and walked back to the window, his eyes staring out into the darkness beyond. His world was falling apart. He was a judge, a man who believed that truth always won, but now he saw how far that truth was from reality for his son. He looked at Elijah again. "Son, I will not let this go unpunished," he said, and there was a steely determination in his voice. Elijah shook his head. "You don't understand. They'll have his back. They always have their backs." James stepped closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm no ordinary man, Elijah. I am a judge, and I will not stop until this man is held accountable for his actions. For you, to everyone who's been through this." James's words sounded firm, but inside he was troubled. He knew that fighting the system would be dirty and dangerous. He knew that this battle could cost him his career, and possibly more. That night, he watched the video again, recording every detail, every phrase. He realized that his job now was not only to protect his son, but also to break down the wall that allowed this policeman to act with such impunity. But Elijah's voice still sounded inside him. "The system doesn't work for people like me." And James wondered if he could change that, or would the system break them both? Elijah walked into the house like a shadow of himself. His steps were heavy, his gaze downcast. When the door closed behind him, he felt the weight of the day crash down on him with renewed force. The oppressive silence of the house seemed louder to him than any screams. His younger sister, Lila, was sitting in the kitchen, drawing something in a notebook. Her face was focused, but when she saw her brother, she looked up. The smile she'd been ready to give him froze. "Elijah, are you okay?" Her voice was soft but insistent. He didn't say anything, just walked past her into the living room where his parents were already waiting. James was standing by the fireplace, his face tense. Elijah's mother, Monica, was sitting on the couch, clutching a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "Sit down, Elijah," James said. His voice was firm but with an unease in it. Elijah sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. There was a pause in the room, heavy and depressing. "What's wrong?" Monica asked softly, her voice full of concern. Elijah looked up, and what they saw in his gaze made her heart clench. It was pain. It wasn't the kind of pain that came and went, but the kind that stayed, embedded deep in her soul. "They made me kneel," he finally uttered. His voice was quiet, but every word sounded like a blow. Lila, who was standing in the doorway, froze. "What?" Monica whispered. "A policeman. He stopped me, said I was suspicious. He made me kneel on the muddy road. He yelled at me, told me I was nobody, that I was a threat. He crushed my bike, tore up my books, and I—" Elijah stopped talking, his voice trembling. "I couldn't do anything." There was silence in the room. Monica covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. Lila came closer and sat next to her brother, hugging him, as if trying to protect him from a pain she couldn't fully understand. "They were looking at me, Mom," Elijah continued. "People. They just stood there and stared, like I'd really done something bad, like I was dirt on their shoes." James gritted his teeth, his fists clenched. He walked to the window, his eyes staring out into the darkness of the street. "This shouldn't have happened," he said through gritted teeth. "But it happened," Elijah replied, and there was bitterness in his voice. "Because I'm black. Because to them, I'll never be equal. Ever." Monica burst into tears. She hugged her son, pulling him close to her, as she had when he was small and frightened. But that couldn't help now. This fear was different, deep and devastating. "I hate it," he whispered, snuggling into her shoulder. "I hate that there was nothing I could do." James turned around, his face stony but his eyes burning with anger. "It's not your fault, Elijah," he said. "It's their fault, and I won't let them think they can treat you like this. They'll answer for it." "How, Daddy?" Elijah's voice trembled. "You think you can make a difference? You think they'll listen to you? They've seen judges and prosecutors. They don't care. It's me. It's always me." His son's words tore at James's heart. He knew Elijah was right. He knew that the system he was protecting was full of cracks, especially for someone like his son. Lila, who had been silent all this time, suddenly sobbed. "Why did they do that to you?" Her voice was full of tears. "It's not like you did anything." Elijah looked at his sister and tried to smile, but instead tears rolled from his eyes. "Just because I look like me," he replied quietly. A family dinner that was supposed to be a quiet time together had turned into a mute testament to broken trust, hurt, and rage. James stood at the window, mentally mapping out a plan of action. He not only had to fight for justice, but also to restore his son's faith. But somewhere deep inside he felt fear. Fear that he might lose this battle. Fear that his son was right, saying that for people like him, the system never worked. Let's pause for one more brief pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you or your loved ones have had something similar in your life. Share your thoughts. We value your opinion. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. James Brooks had never felt so helpless, even during the most complex trials. He was used to handling the toughest cases, unraveling the tangles of lies and restoring justice, but now that injustice had touched his family, his own son, he suddenly felt like he was in the center of a storm that could not be controlled. James, however, was not one to give up. He knew he had no right to stand by. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent watching the video, he sprang into action. James knew the system inside out and realized he had a weapon: his knowledge, his status, his connections. But he also knew that those weapons might be useless against a system that had spent centuries learning to defend itself. The first thing he did was file a formal complaint with the police department. He wrote it personally, recounting every detail, every offensive phrase, every action of the police officer. The complaint was tough, unemotional, backed by video, eyewitness testimony, and a clear demand: disciplinary action, termination of the officer, and a public apology to his son. He also requested an independent investigation. That was the first step. But the response was not long in coming. A day later, James received a polite but clearly formal denial. After an internal investigation, it was determined that the officer's actions met operational standards. Standards. That word cut into his mind like a nail. How could humiliating him, forcing his son to kneel in the mud, meet standards? He contacted the department again, this time with the head of Homeland Security. The conversation was tense. James, holding back his anger, repeatedly explained that the video was irrefutable proof of wrongdoing. But the department head only coldly reminded him, "Mr. Brooks, you should remember that your authority does not extend to the police department. We respect your work, but in this case, the circumstances are clear. The officer was acting within the law." James realized he was facing the biggest obstacle of all, the corporate loyalty of a system that protected its own, even if it went against the truth. It annoyed him that the videotape, seemingly clear evidence, meant nothing to them. He'd had to deal with it on the bench, but it was one thing to be an observer, and quite another to feel it firsthand. Meanwhile, at home, the situation was getting more and more tense. Elijah hardly spoke at all. He avoided his family, sitting in his room for long periods of time, not answering his mother's or sister's questions. His father saw the shadow of fear and helplessness settle in his son's soul. Every morning, Elijah looked in the mirror and saw not the confident teenager he had been, but a man who had been made to feel worthless. One night, as James was trying to compose his appeal again, Elijah walked into the office. His face was blank, his eyes faded. "There's nothing you can do, is there?" he asked, lowering his gaze to the table. James froze. The words hit him in the heart. "Son, I'll make sure this doesn't go unpunished. I promise. What if it doesn't work? If they just brush it off like they always do?" "You don't understand, Dad. This isn't just a cop. This is a system. They protect their own because they think we're different from them." James realized that there was not only truth in those words but also bitterness accumulated over the years. His son had lost faith not only in the system, but also in his father, who, as a judge, was part of it. The next day, he approached an old friend, a journalist who worked for a major news outlet. He handed him the videotape and offered to publish it, despite the risks. The journalist hesitated, reminding James that publishing it would cause a scandal and put his reputation at risk. But James was willing to go along with it. He knew that sometimes the truth required sacrifice. A few days later, the video hit the web. It was viewed by thousands of people and the discussion was instantaneous. People split into two camps. Some condemned the police officer's actions and expressed sympathy for Elijah, while others justified him, saying that he was just doing his job. But James knew this was only the beginning. Not only was his son's name at stake, but his own as well. He could feel invisible forces beginning to weigh on him. He had been hinted at by his colleagues that such actions could be detrimental to his career. But James wasn't about to back down. He saw Elijah show a shadow of hope in his eyes for the first time in days. His son was beginning to believe that fighting was worthwhile, even if victory seemed impossible. And that gave James the strength to keep going, even when he knew he had a long and dangerous road ahead of him against a system that didn't like to lose. The noise of James's fight for justice spread far beyond their quiet neighborhood. The video posted online went viral. Comments poured in by the thousands, some expressing support, others contempt. It was a tough battle for the Brooks family, but they had no idea that the hardest part was just beginning. The next morning, James received his first anonymous call. A gruff voice said without further preamble, "You don't know who you're messing with. Leave this case or you'll regret it." The voice was cold, threatening, and though James was a man accustomed to pressure, he felt a wave of anxiety rise inside. He was silent for a few seconds and then replied firmly, "I will not back down." Laughter erupted in response, and the call cut off. It was only the first signal. The tension grew each day. Anonymous calls came more frequently, not only to James's phone but to his home number as well. Someone was calling deep into the night, whispering vile threats. "You think your family is safe? You better think twice." Elijah seemed to shut down more and more. He started receiving messages on social media. At first, it was short comments under his pictures. "You deserve what happened to you. Maybe this will teach people like you to stay away." Then came the personal threatening messages. Some of them were so repulsive he couldn't bring himself to show them to his parents. One in particular stuck in his mind. "You think you're safe now? Wait, this is just the beginning." James noticed that his son began to avoid socializing. He stopped leaving the house, even going to school with obvious reluctance. His world had shrunk to a room where he sat for hours staring at his phone screen, immersed in fear. "Elijah, what's going on?" James asked him one evening when he walked into the room. The teenager looked up at him with difficulty. There was something in his gaze that tore at James's heart. Fear, pain, shame. "They're texting me," Elijah finally squeezed out. "Who's writing?" James stepped closer, but Elijah pulled away. "It doesn't matter. It's not going to change, Dad. That's what they all think. To them, I'm nothing, and it will be the same for you. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything." James clenched his fists, feeling impotent rage. He knew his son was right. The pressure wasn't just on Elijah. At work, his co-workers were starting to treat him differently. Some hinted directly that his actions were tarnishing the judicial system, while others avoided talking to him altogether. Once, while discussing a case, a senior judge coldly said, "Sometimes personal matters are best left out of public discussion." It sounded like a warning. A few days later, upon returning home, James discovered that someone had left a letter on their doorstep. It was something more sinister than phone calls or messages. The envelope was dirty, and inside was a picture of Elijah taken from afar. On the back, in black letters, it read, "You're playing with fire. Take care of your family." James showed the letter to Monica, but wouldn't tell the children. Monica was horrified. "We have to stop, James," she pleaded. "They could do something terrible. I don't want to lose our family." But James couldn't back down. "If we stop now, it means they've won," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "We can't let them think they can threaten and carry on. We have to fight, for Elijah's sake, for Lila's sake, for everyone's sake." But the pressure continued to build. Elijah stopped sleeping. Every night he heard the sound of footsteps outside his window, and though they might have been just neighbors or random passers-by, fear crept deep into his mind. One night he came to his parents' room and, without saying a word, sat on the floor by their bed. Monica found him there in the morning, curled up in a ball, her heart breaking with pain. The Brooks family was on the brink. The whole world seemed to be tightening its grip around them, trying to break their spirit. But James knew one thing. He couldn't let fear win. In that moment, he made a decision. This was not only a battle for his son, but also for the right to be heard, for the justice that had been trampled upon for so long by those who had sworn to defend it. However, the darkest and most dangerous part of the journey lay ahead of him. James sat at his massive wooden desk, littered with folders, documents, and printouts. The light from the desk lamp caught his tired face in the darkness. He no longer used the nights to sleep, only to search for the truth. Each evening, when the family fell silent, James returned to his battle. He felt he was on the verge of something important, but that something kept eluding him. That all changed one rainy night. James delved into the database he had accessed through his connections. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. The name of the police officer who had humiliated his son popped up in several old complaints. Those cases had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Each had a similar scenario. A young black man stopped without explanation, arrested, or humiliated. The charges were never substantiated, but in each case, the police officer was the one who had Elijah on his knees. James felt his heart clench with anger and bitterness. It was a system that protected its own. They hid the truth, justified violence and humiliation, and covered it all with a thin layer of bureaucratic rhetoric. He found a report that dismissed a complaint from a local teacher. The woman claimed the officer had used force against her, but the file read, "No violation confirmed." With every detail he found, the picture became more and more monstrous. This man hadn't just humiliated his son, he did it to dozens of other people. It was the norm for him. James decided to meet with anyone who had ever filed a complaint. Most of them refused to talk for fear of repercussions. One man James met in a small coffee shop bluntly said, "I tried to fight, but they did everything to break me. They came to my house, scared my family. It's not worth it." But there were those who agreed to talk. A young woman whose brother had been victimized by an officer told James how their family had been forced to move after they dared to file a complaint. "They found a way to destroy us," she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. Meanwhile, the pressure on the Brooks family was at its peak. Driving home one evening, Monica discovered that someone had broken the windows of their car. The windshield was cracked, and the word "silence" was written in red paint on the hood. Elijah, upon hearing the news, became even more withdrawn. He hardly ever left his room, and after the incident, he practically stopped eating. One night, James came in and saw his son sitting in the dark with his arms wrapped around himself. "They hate me, Dad," Elijah pronounced without raising his head. "No, son, they're the ones who hate what you represent." You reminded them that they aren't omnipotent. James sat down next to him, putting his hand on his son's shoulder. "But I'm tired of fighting," Elijah sobbed, and James felt something inside him break. That phrase was a signal to him. He could not wait any longer. The next morning, he handed over all the evidence he had collected to a journalist with whom he was already cooperating. He insisted that the story be made public. Elijah's video was only the beginning. James wanted people to see that this wasn't just one officer's mistake, but a systemic problem. A week later, an article appeared on the front page of a major news website. A cop with a dark past, hidden complaints against an officer accused of racism. The article included the names of the victims, details of their cases, and the evidence James provided. It caused quite a stir. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some expressed outrage and demanded justice. Others defended the officer, saying that the police were just doing their job. But a new round of aggression has descended on the Brooks family. James was threatened by his colleagues. One senior judge bluntly told him, "You're making a huge mistake. This could cost you your career." James's car began to be chased. One evening, as Monica was returning home with groceries, an unknown car followed her. She was forced to swerve into someone else's yard to avoid a collision. James knew he was going against the wind, but it was too late to back down. He understood. The truth he had uncovered was too loud to be ignored. But he also knew his family was in the crosshairs. All he could do was keep fighting, despite the fear and pain that were now constant companions in their lives. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The rows of benches were packed with journalists, activists, and ordinary people whose attention had been drawn to the high-profile case against an officer whose actions had come to symbolize systemic racism. In the dock sat the very same policeman, his face maintaining a stony expression, but his gaze heavy with contempt for James and his family. He knew that, despite all the evidence gathered, the system could have protected him. They always had. James stood at the podium, his confident voice echoing through the room. He presented every piece of evidence, every document, every videotape. He showed the whole picture, not only the humiliation of his son, but the long chain of cruelty and abuse by the accused. Photographs, witness statements, letters of complaint, everything was on the table. James could feel dozens of eyes looking at him. Each gaze held a different emotion: support, doubt, and sometimes outright hostility. But this was no ordinary day in court. James noticed the policemen sitting in the back rows watching his every move. They chattered, glancing back and forth, as if assessing how far he was willing to go. Their presence seemed a crushing reminder. "You're one of us, don't forget that." But James had already stopped being afraid. He had no right to be afraid, not for himself, but for his son. Elijah sat next to his mother and sister, his eyes fixed on his father. For him, this day had been agonizing. He remembered over and over again how he had been forced to kneel on the muddy ground, how he was nothing in the eyes of the crowd. But now he saw his father, this seemingly unshakable man, fighting for him. In that moment, Elijah realized this fight was more than just about him. It was a battle to make sure that no one else would have to go through what he had to experience. When James called his key witness, the hall fell silent. It was a woman who had filed a complaint against the same officer many years earlier. She was one of the few who dared to speak despite her fear. Her voice shook as she recounted how the same police officer pulled her son over after accusing him of stealing a bicycle. "He was only a year older than Elijah," she said. "He didn't do anything wrong, but they put him on the ground and beat him until he cried. He was never the same after that." Tears appeared in her eyes, but she continued. "I tried to fight, but they silenced us. They threatened us, saying that if we continued, my son would not live to adulthood. I gave up the fight, and now I live with it every day." The judge listened intently. Every fact, every voice seemed to break down the wall that had protected the defendant for so long. But the defense did not give up its position. The police officer's lawyer argued that all actions were within the law, that the officer was acting in the interest of public safety. He tried to make James and his family look like people wanting attention, hyping the situation for personal gain. But James didn't let that rhetoric prevail. He addressed the room, the judge, the jury. "This is not just about my son. This is about a system that has turned a blind eye to violence for so long. It's about people who believe their authority makes them untouchable. My son is not the first, but he should be the last." After several hours of hearing and presentation of evidence, it was time for the jury to retire to reach a verdict. The agonizing hours of waiting stretched like an eternity. James sat next to his family, squeezing Monica's hand. Elijah stared at the floor, his face impassive, but inside he was struggling with anxiety. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The judge read the verdict. Guilty. Muffled sighs echoed in the room. For many, it was a triumph of justice. For others, it was another occasion for indignation. The policeman listened to the verdict with cold indifference, but James saw his jaw clench when he heard the words, disqualification from holding public office and criminal punishment for abuse of authority. After the trial, James and his family stood at the exit. The reporters surrounded them, asking questions, but James, holding Elijah's shoulder tightly, answered only briefly, "This is just the beginning." Elijah felt relief, but it was bitter. Yes, justice had been served, but the scars left by this experience would not fade. Though their fight was over, James knew that the system they had stood against was not broken. It was a victory in one battle, but the war for equality and justice was just beginning. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your opinion is very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each and every one of you. Support us by subscribing to the channel and liking us so you don't miss other important stories. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul.